One of the forgotten queens of England from the medieval period was Catherine of Valois. She reigned as a consort to her husband Henry V for just over 2 years before her husband died. During her time on the throne, she gave birth to Henry VI, the heir and successor, but after her own death her remains were treated terribly and were left out in the open in Westminster Abbey for centuries. Today she has been interred inside of the Abbey in an elaborate tomb, but for so long her remains were messed with by people who visited and wanted to come and see the body of the Queen. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, even wrote how, on Shrove Tuesday 1669, I to the Abbey went, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth. Reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen, and this my birthday, and I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen. But what is the shocking story of the desecration of the unburied Queen of England? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Catherine of Valois was the youngest daughter of King Charles VI of France. Negotiations for her to marry the future King Henry V of England began early on, and Henry V would later become a thorn in the side of the French. He led a spectacular victory at the Battle of Agincourt, and the plans for him to marry the French princess then continued. Catherine, it's believed, was a beautiful young lady, and a peace agreement was signed along with the acknowledgement from Catherine's father that Henry V of England was his heir. Catherine came to England following their marriage, and she was crowned Queen at Westminster Abbey on the 23rd of February 1421. Her husband continued to fight in France, and whilst he was away, Catherine gave birth to a son named Henry, who later became the heir and the future King Henry VI. But Henry V, her husband, would never see his son, as he would die in France after becoming sick, and before her 21st birthday, Catherine was made a widow, and she then became a Queen Dowager. But following the king's death, she was seen as a catch, and many important English noblemen wanted to marry her, and they would then ultimately be the stepfather of the king. She later married Owen Tudor, the grandfather of the future King Henry VII, and the pair had a number of children. But on the 3rd of January 1437, shortly after childbirth, Catherine of Valois died. It's believed she may have been ill for some time, as she went to Bermondsey Abbey to pray for her health, but this had little effect. She made a will 3 days before her death, and she was given a huge funeral. But her remains were embalmed shortly after her death, and her internal organs were removed to keep away decay. The cavity was then stuffed with herbs and spices, and her body was wrapped in cerecloth, a heavy wax-coated cloth, and it was encased in lead before it was placed into a wooden coffin. Her organs were removed, and it's believed they were buried in other locations. At the time, the tradition was that organs would be buried in churches where the funeral processions stopped, and they were buried away from the body. She was given a first funeral at St Catherine's Church, before she was given a second one at Westminster Abbey. On top of her coffin was an effigy of her, which was carved from wood and looked rather realistic, and it was dressed in Catherine's clothes. The coffin was covered in cloth of gold, and she was then laid to rest in an alabaster tomb inside Westminster Abbey near to her first husband, Henry V. But this would not be the end of her story. The tomb was temporary, as her son, Henry VI, wanted a larger memorial to be made for her, but he died, and then Henry VII, following the Wars of the Roses, demolished the Old Lady Chapel where she was buried. In this her tomb was destroyed, and her body was then unearthed. The outer wood coffin was found in the decades following to have been decayed, and her remains were then taken out of this, and out of the inner lead-lined coffin. It was placed into a wooden chest with flat sheets of lead placed on top from the chapel's roof. The chest was then placed at the foot of Henry V's tomb, and she was left there unburied for over 300 years. It's believed Henry VII may have destroyed her tomb to distance himself from his grandfather, but he did state in his will that he wanted to be laid to rest alongside Queen Catherine of Valois. But Henry VII died before the Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey was finished, and his son Henry VIII never returned to rebury Catherine of Valois, his great-grandmother. Her body remained above ground in the Abbey, and the chest in which she was placed had 2 lids, and visitors to the Abbey would be shown her remains regularly, and on a daily basis when they asked. One witness pulled back the cerecloth from her face and said that, the bones being firmly united and thinly clove like flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather. Many said her skin had no clothing over it, and Catherine was buried naked in her shroud, and she was then displayed. The Abbey's tour guides would make money showing people the remains of Catherine of Valois, and as mentioned, people would pick up her body, embrace it, and Samuel Pepys stated he even kissed the 200-year-old corpse of the former queen. The mistreatment of her body continued into the 18th century, and it was said that a group of young scholars had amused themselves by tearing her body into pieces, and it was described as a shapeless mass of whitish colour. But she was then, to make this less likely to happen, interred briefly inside of a vault in the Abbey. She was left here for around a century inside the Villiers vault. Then Queen Victoria, during her reign, gave permission to try and find the remains of Catherine of Valois. Her remains were found on top of a pile of coffins beneath the effigy. Her coffin had fallen against a damp wall, and the wood coffin had rotted slightly. When people tried to pick it up, it stuck to the coffin below and was difficult to remove. Within a few hours in the atmosphere, the coffin then fell to pieces. But on inspection, it was shockingly found that the Queen's remains had been tampered with further, and shockingly parts of it were missing. Some claimed her remains had been doused with lime, and that parts of her body had been consumed by this. But the entire front part of her skull was missing, and there was one piece from the back of it found on her pelvis. Most of her vertebrae was also missing, and there was only one of her ribs left, and two of her right arm bones. Not one of her teeth could be found, and they had been taken as souvenirs. Her legs were encased in 12 layers of cerecloth and were in perfect condition, and it was said some of the skin on her right arm was supple. Under her head also were the remains of a wooden pillow, and it was then reinterred. One witness stated, "It was a striking and impressive scene, which I ever shall remember, and which at a time it was impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains, and followed Mr. Poole and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his hand one small lantern to light us, led the way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Sharp and myself followed, no one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into some sort of processional order. I remarked to him, we were attending the Queen's 3rd funeral. Not a word was said as we passed slowly round the ambulatory in the darkness. Her remains were then placed into another thick English oak coffin, and parts of the old chest were placed in the new one. But 400 years after her death, Catherine of Valois finally had the tomb of a queen amongst the kings and queens in Westminster Abbey. Throughout the years her remains were treated terribly and were desecrated, and were subject to many horrors. Her remains were taken. It's possible today that still today there are elements of her body and remains inside of family collections across the nation, being passed down through different generations after being taken as a souvenir. But Catherine of Valois was a French medieval princess who married the King of England, uniting the 2 warring nations, and she was a mother of King Henry VI. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.